So I'm Jeff DeBelco. I'm a professor and associate dean at Ohio University's Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. I'm also a senior advisor at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program in Washington, D.C. We've been working on environment and security research, environmental science research, and how that connects to security policy. And initially we started focusing on U.S. national security policy. And along the way, in bringing those two worlds together, the environmental scientists and the security practitioners, we discovered actually there's a lot of value in making that a wider lens, a more inclusive notion of security. So environmental science and security has been a focus to try to build a bigger network of a community where those worlds have greater opportunity to interact and learn from one another, where we could build a shared understanding of how those two worlds worked. The world of the environmental scientists who are doing bench science, basic science, publishing for peer review outlets and their colleagues, and the national security practitioners and what questions and what challenges and what issues they had that might have bearing and benefit from greater understanding of environmental science. We then started asking questions about what are those questions, identifying what are existing research areas that would be relevant and connect, what are areas that could be of great interest that aren't as developed or aren't put together. And so we had a workshop that brought those environmental scientists together with those national security practitioners and achieved what, from my perspective, is a successful meeting where when you walk in, you don't already know everyone in the room. So this was really a group that was new to each other, and that was an objective, to bring folks together who haven't before, provide that opportunity. And I think through the course of that workshop and subsequent interviews and conversations, and then a lot of time trying to bring these worlds together in various formats, here in the United States, but also abroad, we've come to a couple conclusions as we chart a path towards exploring ways that the environmental science world and the security world might have greater interaction to the benefit of both. First, we commonly assume that basic science that's driven by curiosity and the research agendas of scientists is not connected, not interesting, not relevant to the fast-acting world of security that is about responding to crises. And we found that wasn't the case for a couple reasons. One, that the questions that are of interest to, and concerns of interest to national security practitioners, they go far beyond questions of war and peace in today's crisis. It's a huge institution with lots of different cultures, lots of different concerns, lots of different tools in terms of responding to them, and so can cast a much wider net in terms of what kind of environmental science questions are interesting and relevant. And therefore, a number of areas of environmental science, some that are very well established and some that are still have lots of ways to go, lots of puzzles, lots of questions that are directly relevant and of interest to different segments of a security community, because it really is about security communities and lots of different parts of that. And so in that sense, while there is a fairly widely held view that science for science sake research is disconnected and not of interest to the security community, we found that wasn't the case. Certainly there are plenty of areas that the relevance is not as direct, but nevertheless, a lot of areas that one might assume is not. We had some examples of that. We had representatives from the Alaska National Guard talking about really interested in coastal erosion rates. And the science seemed to be relatively settled on wind and ice, but now with a greater incidence of slush and erosion rates. That was an area that the scientists in the room said, well, maybe the science isn't as settled as it could be on that. And that's an area that could come in dialogue. Well, why does the National Guard care about it? It's about where you put a base, What are the impacts on existing infrastructure? If you are responsible for moving communities away from that coastline that's eroding, those are all planning and decision and deployment decisions where the science is critically important. So in that first category, a lot of things that we may assume in the environmental science realm that are not relevant to security can be. A second area is where environmental scientists, and by environmental scientists, both the social, the natural, physical, and engineering, are already looking at questions that are connected to questions that are associated with security. So those include issues of war and peace, from natural resources, environmental degradation, environmental depletion, climate change. How do those play into questions of conflict stability and peace building? But they go far beyond that as well to understand that combinations of climate change impacts on the Tibetan Plateau combined with Chinese hydro plans on the upper reaches of the Mekong have potentially fundamental implications for food security in downstream countries in the lower reaches of the Mekong. Those are issues that are affecting the economic, the human well-being, and ultimately the political stability of those countries. And therefore, those are research questions where there is activity, not as sustained, not as easy to find the funding, in part because it's bringing different worlds together, it's interdisciplinary, and that's an area that could garner greater support. Also, particularly because some of the ongoing work is not necessarily a new question to science that attracts greater funding. It may be an ongoing tracking and updating, and yet those kinds of databases and that kind of analysis is a benefit. Third and final category is that what really is in some ways too much to expect of the environmental scientists and the national security practitioners is for them to find one another directly. And so the transaction costs of doing that are very high. So the importance of platforms where interpreters, translators, connectors, matchmakers who have a foot in both of those worlds, or at least understand the timelines, the budget processes, the organizational flowchart, what the priorities are in those, the importance of those connecting institutions, platforms, and some of them we have, but they're not being used in this way. Some which suggest that we should look proactively to develop them if those are connections we want to build. And so existing science, congruent science or convergent science, and then finally platforms to do it were three areas that we saw as productive ways that the environmental science community and the security community could come together. I think there are a number of takeaways from this process of trying to understand environmental science and national security. One is that there are great needs for more sustained funding lines. We have really interesting research that pops up and is supported in the short term but then disappears. And there are real questions that warrant greater sustained attention for interdisciplinary and convergent research that goes across the traditional funding mechanisms, across the traditional disciplines. Second, we need to have kind of greater room for almost good enough science, in that the different views of uncertainty between these two communities actually matter. In the security realm, those decisions have to be made whether the science is settled or not. And so in many respects, the question is, please give us, even if there's a lower threshold of certainty around the science, we're still interested in that. And so having a interesting conversation about what is certainty, what is uncertainty, and what's good enough in terms of the science. At the heart of it, this fundamental notion that more science questions and scientific research are of interest and relevant to a broad set of security actors is critically important, a critical takeaway. We just assume that it is issues of war and peace only, and that's just not the case. I think the other big, seems straightforward, but we often treat the security community as a homogeneous singular unit. We have the Pentagon, and that lends itself to the suggestion there's a Pentagon view. Well, there are many cultures, many actors with very different tools, very different concerns. And so really understanding that gives us a sense of the diversity in ways that make sense for why a whole wider range of environmental science would be relevant to different security actors. There are a number of hot topics that were identified as particularly important environmental science questions, particularly bringing in the social science and the human response to that environmental change and driving that environmental change and what it might mean for a broader notion of security. So environmental change, climate change, and migration, the movement of people. Part of that topic is the dramatic trend towards greater urbanization. Geoengineering as a response to climate change, as the alternatives to our traditional mitigation cooperation mechanisms, we're finding it's not moving fast enough. So as folks look to geoengineering as a way to address climate change, what does that imply? Interest in conflict, but conflict short of organized violence. So what are the impacts of protests and social movements in response to or relevant to environmental change, and questions that are connected that way. Critical infrastructure, and then of course there are always key countries and key regions where they are already identified as questions in a security realm, but bringing the greater nuance and understanding around underlying conditions and environment and how that plays into the political, the economic, the food security futures of those countries, particularly when we seem to have changes that are more rapid than we're used to, and uncertainty around the impacts of those changes. As we continue the dialogue between environmental science and security, I think we can look to a couple areas where action could productively be focused. One is bringing more social science into the convergence research. The natural social science divide has been there, and we have lots of efforts to try to bridge them. Our conversations with security practitioners say that that is a positive direction, a welcome direction, because those intersections of social science and natural science questions are ones that they're keenly interested in. I think there's lots of interest in modeling and connecting modeling in its kind of natural science or environmental science realm to some of the other decision modeling that the security community commonly works with. And so finding ways that models, the understandings from them can have greater interaction and connection. I think understanding, again, fundamentally that it's a wider set of scientific questions that are of interest, environmental science interest to the security community, and that we move beyond the hopefully already outdated, but the notion that the environmental scientist does the research and hands it over, and then it's a one-way street, one-way dialogue on science to policy. And instead, the importance of platforms where these two worlds can come together, not to drive each other's agendas, but to have interaction, understand expertise sits in both places, different tools, different objectives, different incentive structures, but that in-person and virtual and shared platforms are ways that are critical to lower the transaction costs, increase the understanding and opportunity when it makes sense for there to be these interactions. Then it can be done so in a way that doesn't require the professionals on either side to be something that they're not or can't be.